Testament introduction. Our class this evening brings us back again, as he said, to the book of Judges. We got through most of the introductory material the previous week. We've got a few more things in that area. First of all, let's go back to our chart here, because we quickly did that last time. So let's make sure we all understand what's going on in the chronology of Judges. I think that's the last thing we were dealing with was the authorship, and under that we were looking at some of the problem texts, and then along with that some of the chronological problems. This is your Old Testament patriarchs and judges. I think that's, what color is that? Blue? The blue one? It's the one with the icons on it there. Well, some of yours are other editions. This is the 5th edition. If you got the 5th edition, you might have some people there. How do they know what those men look like? I don't know. But it's good to get them off. That way your children won't see them, because otherwise they'll grow up like you grew up and I grew up, and we all know exactly what Moses looks like. So as long as they never ever see that, they'll never have any idea. They won't have to fight that like we do. Okay, we're down towards the, right under Old Testament patriarchs and judges, the whole name of the chart there. You go down under the Hyksos kings at Avarice or Zoan. You come down there to Joshua. We've changed a few of these figures. It doesn't appear like he really gives enough time for Joshua here. He gives the 7 years, that would really be, according to our chronology, 1407 to, 1400 is what it would amount to, 1407 to 1400 for the conquest of Canaan. He's got 1405 to 1398. Remember, we had to move the Exodus back 2 years, from 1445 to 1447. But anyway, just staying with what he's got from 1398 then to 1390, he only gives us 8 years for the second half of the book of Joshua. Now, he does have a question mark there, so that's a questionable date according to him and according to me and according to you. If you remember what we said about Joshua, it appeared that he would have remained a governor of the land a lot more than just 8 years there that he left over for us. Then that gives us 9 years for the elders. Remember the end of Joshua and the beginning of the book of Judges. It speaks of that group of men who overlived or outlived Joshua, the elders that had seen all the marvelous works of the Lord. We really have no idea how long of a time they were in the land after Joshua's death and before the beginning of the period of the Judges, but he's given us 9 years. We'll just leave it like that. Then you see the break in between your solid gray lines. The gray bars now are the ones that we'll be looking at, because on these we have our judges and later on our kings here on this chart. And here we've got this king of Mesopotamia, Cushan-Rishathaim. We have a period here of oppression, and you'll see in between a lot of these bars, you have the period of oppression. This is a fourfold cycle. Then you end up with a new judge being raised up. Let's see, after Othniel, you go on to the Moabites, Eglon. I believe he had some Amorites and Ammonites along with him and his Moabites and fighting against Israel. Ehud. Now, down at the very bottom left-hand side is something interesting. Remember, we showed you from counting up in a consecutive manner the length of years given to each one of the judges, along with the length of years given to the oppression of Israel. It added up to 410 years, which simply just could not fit in there. And here's another example of perhaps an overlapping here. You see Ehud, and right along with that, Shamgar, at the same period of time here. Now, he's got double question marks around Shamgar. That's because, let's see, Shamgar's dealt with in the very last verse of Judges 3. We don't have any time reference given to him at all. We know that he rules right after Ehud and before Deborah, because Deborah goes on to mention Shamgar. He's the only one that Deborah mentions in her song of victory in Judges 5. So Shamgar is going to come before Deborah and Barak, and it would appear to be during the same time of Ehud. Now, another thing on the chronology here, let's see, notice up above Ehud you see Jabin, king of Hazor. Now, this is way up in Naphtali, in northern Galilee of today. Now, we counted this period, I don't see how many years that is, but however many years Jabin there is oppressing the Israelites. Let's see, that's 20 years. Yeah, that's what he has, according to Judges 4 and verse 3. Now, that's 20 years right there. But remember, whenever we would have counted these things up, we would have counted them up consecutively, but there you've got, according to this map, this chart, you've got that whole period of oppression by the Canaanites under Jabin, king of Hazor, occupying the exact same time period as the very end of Ehud's reign. Therefore, we'd strike 20 years out right there. You following what I'm saying there? So this chart ought to help you see how these don't all fit together consecutively. And also down towards the right end, you see Eli there, who is also one of the judges. He's not covered in this book, but we'll see him later on. And notice directly above Eli, first of all, you have the very end of Jair's reign. Then you've got the Ammonite oppression. Then you've got Jephthah, Ibzan, and Elon. All those aren't consecutive, they're all overlapping each other. And then underneath Eli, you've got the Philistine oppression. You've got Samson, just a little bit. And then, of course, at Eli's death, you've got the beginning of Samuel. Now go over to, keep your chart out, but go over to Judges 10. This was one particular hint that we have in the book, and I'm going to give you another one, going back to Shamgar here in a moment. But this was one particular hint in the book of Judges showing us that we're not to add all of these years up end on end, that is, consecutively. And we briefly gave you this verse last time. We want to come back to it again. Judges 10, we just gone through the 6th and the 7th judge, I believe. And so now that they are dead, Jair's dead, the 7th judge here in verse 3 has died. Then Israel goes right back into her sin and apostasy. And notice verse 7. The anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the children of Ammon. Now that is stated in advance of our last two judges here, our two important ones. We've got three in between these two. But Jephthah and Samson, which we'll be looking at next week, these are our two important last judges. Jephthah is going to be delivering them from the Ammonites, and Samson is going to be delivering them from the Philistines. But verse 7 of chapter 10 is just given us as a prelude to what's going to take place here later on in the book during the section of the book that deals with the period of the judges. However, if you'll go to your map here, now that would appear that God sold them into the hands of both of these people at the same time, which is what did take place. However, if you'll go to your chart, look there above Eli again, between the judges Jair and Jephthah, and there you have the Ammonites. You see that? That's between 1105 and 1087. And notice it says in the east, because each one of these oppressions, along with each one of these judgeships, occupying space and time in Israel, was only had to do with a part of the nation of Israel and not the whole country all at the same time. So here the Ammonites in the east, notice he's got them ending 1087 and drop down just directly below that, all the way down to your other date, 1087. And notice it says Philistine oppression in the west. Well, he's got the Ammonites oppressing them, and then as soon as they finish, the Philistines oppressing. But according to Judges 10 and verse 7, those would be overlapping together right there. So you see the Philistine line should either be drawn back further to the left or the Ammonite line drawn further over to the right, one or the other, because we're going to have to get those two heathen countries around them, their reign and oppression over Israel, overlapping one another, according to what's said here in Judges 10 and verse 7. Now, if that is true, which we believe it is, then also you're going to have to move Samson, where you see him there 1067 or 1069 to 1049, Samson in the west. You're going to have to move him back accordingly to the left in order to coincide with the Philistine oppression, because this is the great enemy that comes during the time of Samson and Samuel, and of course they rise again in the time of David. And David's the one who finally suppresses the Philistines. They were comprised of a sea people who had come from Asia Minor and had settled on the western coast of Israel and just stayed there for many, many years. Okay, so there's one hint that we have. We've got overlapping periods of oppression. Judges 10:7, the Ammonites and the Philistines. So it would appear that we're going to have to change something on the map here. Now we have another hint back earlier in Judges chapter 3. And this has to do with Shamgar. Now he has him drawn on the map underneath Ehud, and he's assuming that, and that is a correct assumption because it's implied in the end of Judges chapter 3. Now see, all we would need, what I'm trying to show you is that all we would need are a couple of examples here where the book of Judges gives us a hint that we have overlapping time periods to completely destroy any theory of 410 years for the whole period of the Judges. All we need is a couple of exceptions to that, and then we could assume that, if need be, there are other overlapping either oppressions or judgeships which maybe we're not able to tell, but which nonetheless did occur and did take place, and therefore 1 Kings 6:1 in the 480-year period between the Exodus and the 4th year of Solomon's reign poses no problem to us at all. Now this is concerning the second and the third judge. Now the second judge is Ehud. Notice in verse 30, Judges 3. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. Now this is the longest period of rest that she has, by the way, during the time of the Judges, is Ehud's period. But we're not to assume that Ehud himself had to live this whole 80-year period. Now notice on your map here, you've got a long line there for Ehud. But since it goes on in verse 31 to say, and after him, and we would assume after Ehud's death, but not necessarily after that period of 80 years of peace and prosperity. After him was Shamgar, the son of Anab, which slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. Now we could have a period of prosperity, let's say over in eastern Palestine, but then we'd need Shamgar over in western Palestine to deliver them from the Philistines. While at the same time, we could still put Shamgar within this 80-year period that Judges 3:30 leaves us with for the period of prosperity and peace due to the effects of the judgeship of Ehud on the nation of Israel. So in both of those places, we're given a clear hint that we've got something overlapping, because he, Shamgar, of all of them, is the only one that we're not given a time period to. So we have to assume he's going to fit into someone else's time period. And I'll just show you the verse, Judges 5 and 6, where he's mentioned in the song of Deborah and Barak. So we know that he came before Deborah, and that have to put him during the time of Ehud. Okay, I believe that's all we need to see on our map here at this time. Let me give you the purpose for this book. It's a threefold purpose that we see manifested in three different areas. The purpose of the book of Judges. Remember, we go through each one of the books and try to determine the author's purpose of giving us the book. First of all, it's a historical purpose to give us the history of Israel from the death of Joshua to the time of Samuel. From the death of Joshua to the time of Samuel, around 300 or a little over 300-year time period. One of the most barbarous and bloody periods that Israel ever experienced in the Old Testament. One of utter confusion and ruin and destruction. And so we need to know what has been taking place here in Israel during these 300 years, and that's the purpose of the book of Judges. To supply us the historical link between the death of Joshua and the time of the prophet and the judge Samuel. Secondly, the purpose is to show us the moral and economic problems of a people delivered right out of slavery and blessed with the very best of everything. Now, you can sum that up however you want to sum it up, but you think about that. Here we've got a group of slaves, friends. They've been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And all of a sudden, God gives them the very best land in the world. He said, I watch over it with my own eye. He said it's flowing with milk and honey, symbolic to represent the good pasture land for your goats and your herds and your flocks and so forth. He completely destroys their enemies before them when they trust in Him. Therefore, they have a great spoil they're able to take from their enemies. And this is kind of difficult. It's like, someone coming out of prison and getting into something good. They don't know how to handle something like that. Or like giving a child. Some people give their children allowances, like give them $10 a week allowance or something. Child doesn't know what to do with $10, and except spend it. And then, of course, American society wonders why we're such spendthrifts. It's because our parents had given us a $10 allowance since we were 3 years old, before we knew what money was. And we knew how to blow that in a hurry on ice cream and candy and toys and stuff like that. And so when we get 23, you know what? We do the same thing with our money. The same thing all over again. And so this is a problem in Israel. She's been a people in slavery, not knowing how to manage their own affairs, not having their own rulers over them, not being able to go in and out as they will, not having their own possessions before. And whenever they come out of Egypt, they ask of the Egyptians gold and silver, and they spoil the Egyptians. Exodus, the book of Exodus tells us. So now they have all of this wealth. Now they come into land, and look how much they possess. Now here again, with each one of these things, you can see a spiritual type or principle, not necessarily a type, but a principle to apply in your own life. And that is to don't expect all the blessings yesterday before you know how to handle them. Because you'll end up just like the period of the Judges, worshiping other gods and so forth, worshiping the material possessions that God does want to bless you with, but not until you know how to handle them, rather than have them handle you. So this just completely destroyed Israel at this time. A whole nation of slaves given the very best land, the best of everything, and they don't know what to do with it. They don't know. Their morals and their economic principles are very shallow and slack. Regardless of what God's given them in the past, they've not heeded that. And therefore, they really need more of a time of preparation before they go in and try to do what they're doing here. Then thirdly, the purpose of the book of Judges is to show us the need for a righteous leader in Israel. Remember 4 times, I think we gave you last time, chapter 17, verse 6, 18, verse 1, 19, verse 1, 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And in 2 places there, 17:6 and 21:25. 21:25, by the way, is your memory verse over here. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. You see, we don't have a righteous leader. So what Judges is preparing us for is the time of the monarchy, when God will set up a righteous and godly leader over his people. It wasn't enough just to have the judges raised up. As we compared last time with the charismatic movement, these charismatic leaders raised up, because then when they die, then every man does that which is right in his own eyes. But what we need is a righteous king set over us. And of course, that's what I was stressing last time in the restoration of the message of the headship of the Lord Jesus Christ. An invisible king for right now, but it won't be too many days hence before he'll be a visible king here on the earth. And so we see the same thing tying in here. The charismatic movement in our realm, like the book of Judges, is preparing us for the time of the monarchy. And that's when there will be one God, and his name will be one, and he'll be king over all the earth. Hallelujah. Praise God. He's going to reign over there, Zechariah 14 says, right in Mount Zion, in his holy hill on Zion. And that's where David set up his holy hill there on Zion. And so David's son is going to come and set up his reign. And the Bible says there will never be an end to his kingdom. So there's a threefold purpose here to the book of Judges that ought to help you understand things a little more. Go over to your last verse so you can see it, since that's your memory verse, 21:25. Last verse in the book, but it's so characteristic of the whole book. That's why we have it placed here at the end. It just sums up everything that's been said thus far. In those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And it said earlier in 17:6, the very same thing. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Terrible period, as I've said, of Israel's history. Now there's another problem we need to come to here. That is the critical question, the question that the critics raise concerning the alleged contradiction between the speedy destruction of Israel's enemies as portrayed in the book of Joshua and the slow destruction of her enemies as portrayed in the book of Judges. Or to say it another way, the critics tell us that in the book of Joshua, Joshua tells us that they completely destroyed everyone in Canaan. They completely possessed the land. They obeyed everything that God had said for them to do. And therefore, we've got a great contradiction when we open up to the book of Judges, and they have hardly destroyed anyone at all. And Judges comes right after the time of Joshua. And so one of the texts they'll give is over in Joshua 21, verse 43. Now there are several other ones, but here's one in Joshua 21:43. But you need to see that God has just given them the earnest of their inheritance. As Joshua himself says in the book, and they just skip over another scripture back in chapter 13 that we'll turn to in a moment. Joshua 21:43, and the Lord gave unto Israel. Now again, look what it says, all the land. Now that doesn't mean all literally though. It's the earnest. He's given them the earnest of their inheritance, and now he wants them to go in and possess the rest of it themselves. So you got to take this scripture in light of what's said earlier in Joshua and what's said later in the book of Judges. The Lord gave unto Israel all the land which he sware to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. And the Lord gave them rest round about, according to all that he sware unto their fathers. And there stood not a man of all their enemies before them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. And there failed not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel. All came to pass. Now, if you took only those three verses, then we've got a problem with Judges right away. Because it says that the Lord gave them all the land, and Judges doesn't tell us now that they've lost some land that they had back in Joshua. It tells us they never have gotten the land. Even from Joshua's day, they never did take the land. But I want to show you a verse that the critics don't like, and that's in Joshua 13. To show you that there's no contradiction between the speedy portrayal in Joshua and the slow portrayal in Judges of the possession of the land of Canaan by the Israelites. The Joshua 13, verse 1. Now Joshua was old and stricken in years, and the Lord said unto him, Thou art old and stricken in years, and there remaineth yet very much land to be possessed. Now he said that before what he says over here in 21. Now they're not doing any more conquering. See, you've got to remember, what did we tell you? The first half of the book, the first 12 chapters, the conquest of the land. The last 12 chapters, the organization of the land. As a matter of fact, the chapter before this one we're looking at, chapter 12, gives us the list of the 31 kings that they destroyed, both on the east and the west side of the Jordan River. So they're not going out and doing any more conquest later on here in Joshua. And Joshua himself says, there remains yet very much land to be possessed. But then he comes himself later on and says, the Lord's given us all the land. But he just means that he's given us the earnest of the land. And he goes on, I believe, he goes on to tell us some of the land. This is the land that yet remaineth. All the borders of the Philistines, and all Geshuri, from Sihor, which is before Egypt, even unto the borders of Ekron, that's over in the Philistine territory, northward, which is counted to the Canaanites. 5 lords of the Philistines. Then you've got these 5 cities, Gaza, Ashdod, Escalon, and so forth. From the south, all the land of the Canaanites, and Merara, that is beside the Zidonians, unto Aphek, to the border of the Amorites, the land of the Giblites, and so forth. So he gives us a lot of land here that he specifies himself, land that's not yet been taken by the children of Israel. Now let me explain it to you in another way. What Israel did take, on the whole, were all the mountainous regions, because those were the regions less desirable of your various areas in Palestine. Now, does anyone know why they took the mountainous region rather than the valleys and the plains and the fields? Because of what? Herdsmen? No, I said, why did they take the mountains? They've got all the cattle with them. They need the pasture land. But they don't get it, though. Why do they? Okay, that's true. That's part of it. But what's the major reason, though, why they don't get the plains? It's because the Philistines and the Canaanites had a monopoly in the area of iron and the smelting of iron. And they were able to make themselves chariots. And, of course, chariots can't run over the mountains. Chariots are the things that run in the valleys. And Israel couldn't conquer them because of their chariots that they had. And this continues all the way over into the book of 1 Samuel, where the Philistines and the Canaanites own and have a complete monopoly in the field of iron. Because Israel at this time, she of course does not have her iron implements that she needs, the shields and spears and swords and things like this, and especially the chariots, which was one thing God said they couldn't have in the first place. The chariots and the horses, God told them back in Deuteronomy 18, don't go down to Egypt and multiply to yourselves horses and chariots. I want you to trust in me. But because they're not trusting in the Lord, then we've got a problem with the chariots of iron. Now let me just show you a couple of scriptures here. Judges 1 and verse 19. And this states it all in a nutshell in Judges 1 and verse 19. And the Lord was with Judah. Now that means only to a certain degree, though. And he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. So you see, Israel got left with all the land that she couldn't really use. As you said here, our brother, what they needed were the valleys, because they had so many cattle and herds and flocks that they needed to feed in pasture land. But they're stuck with the hills. Let's see, in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, another passage. The Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, that reigned in Hazor. Now this is up in the possession of Naphtali in northern Galilee. The captain of whose host was Sisera, which dwelt in Harosheth of the Gentiles. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and 20 years he mightily oppressed the children of Israel. That's why over there in Judges 15, they sang that song that Pharaoh and his chariots the Lord has thrown into the sea. Now, they had no problem with the chariots then because they were trusting in the Lord. Now, here they're relying on each other, their own military skill, and they're relying on themselves. That is, each individual tribe is relying on itself along with relying on other tribes to give them the victory rather than relying on the Lord. And God goes on here in the book of Judges and tells them purposely that I'm just going to leave those inhabitants there to prove you and to try you to see whether you're going to follow them or whether you're going to follow me. And so he left them there. And they had quite a time trying to get these people out. As a matter of fact, they never do possess the whole land until the time of King David. And when David comes on the scene with all of his military exploits, then they are able to take the whole land. They keep it all the way through the reign of Solomon. And then, of course, after that, with Jeroboam and Rehoboam, in 931, you've got a division of the kingdom, and they're going downhill from then on out. Okay, let me give you the chronological order of the book, because it's not the same as the order consecutively, from chapter 1, 2, 3, all the way through 21. They're not in chronological order. We've got three divisions. Chapter 1, then after chapter 1 comes chapters 17 through 21. Now, you see, you might not have known that. That's the end of the book. Well, we've got a twofold appendices that's added on, tacked on to the end of the book after the period of the Judges. But really, this took place at the very beginning of the period of the Judges. So chapter 1 comes first chronologically, then chapters 17 through 21, and that would leave us with 2 through 16, the third chronological order. So chapter 1 comes first, then chapters 17 through 21, and then chapters 2 through 16. For the continued chapters 17 through 21, and that would leave us with 2 through 16, the third chronological order. So chapter 1 comes first, then chapters 17 through 21, and then chapters 2 through 16. Now, there are several events that occur here in the book of Judges that we've seen earlier in Joshua. There are three events, to be specific, that we've already seen mentioned back in the book of Joshua, but they didn't really take place during the time of Joshua. They were later additions to the book of Joshua. These events took place during the period of the Judges, and I want to give these to you. First of all, Caleb's conquest of Hebron, seen in Joshua 14, 13 through 15. Well, let's turn back there and look at that. Joshua 14, that's the Give Me This Mountain chapter, the good faith chapter. Joshua 14, verses 13 through 15. We could really go a little earlier. Remember, Joshua is still alive at this time, and Caleb has come to him in verses 6 through 8 and said, now, Moses said that whenever we came into the promised land, and you had to give me whatever I wanted to claim by faith. And so he says, I want Hebron. Give me this mountain. And Joshua said, all right, I'll give it to you. Now, right on, in the end of this chapter, verses 13 through 15, he goes right on and takes Hebron. But that doesn't happen here. It's given to us in Joshua to keep the sequence flowing there, to keep things flowing, to keep the narrative flowing. That doesn't happen until years later before Caleb ever takes Hebron, because we don't see this until later on in Judges. But it would appear, just from reading Joshua 14, that Caleb went right on in after Joshua said you can have the mountain and take it. Joshua blessed him, that is Caleb, and gave unto Caleb the son of Jephunneh Hebron for an inheritance. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite unto this day, because that he wholly followed the Lord God of Israel. And the name of Hebron before was Kirjath Arba, which Arba was a great man among the Anakim, and the land had rest from war. Now he goes on in and takes the land here, but turn over to Judges 1. And we'll see that it really doesn't take place there chronologically. It happens later on, the period of the Judges. Judges 1, verse 1, and then verses 10 and 11. Now remember, Joshua's still alive there in Joshua 14, right? Okay, watch Judges 1:1. Now after the death of Joshua, certain things came to pass, which he's going to tell us about in chapter 1. And notice one of those things. Verse 10. And Judah went out against the Canaanites that dwelt in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron before was Kirjath Arba, and they slew Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai, and from thence this is Caleb here because he's mentioned by name in verse 12, he went against the inhabitants of Debir, and the name of Debir before was Kirjath Sepher. So it's not until after the death of Joshua that Caleb takes Hebron. Okay, a second event that we have mentioned in Joshua that doesn't take place during the time of Joshua is Othniel's conquest of Kirjath Sepher. Joshua 15, verses 16 to 17. Othniel's conquest of Kirjath Sepher. Joshua 15, verses 16 and 17. And Caleb said, He that smiteth Kirjath Sepher and taketh it, to him will I give Achsah my daughter to wife. And so his nephew, Othniel, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, took it, and he gave him Achsah, his daughter, to wife. So this is Othniel taking Kirjath Sepher. And it's mentioned here in Joshua, but it doesn't really occur during this time. It occurs in Judges 1, verses 12 to 13. And Caleb said, this is almost word for word now, almost word for word according to what Joshua had said. And Caleb said, He that smiteth Kirjath Sepher and taketh it, to him will I give Achsah my daughter to wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him Achsah, his daughter, to wife. But this comes after verse 1, where we're told Joshua died, here in verse 1. So it comes after that. This is a second event, seen in Joshua, but that doesn't occur there. Finally, the migration of the Danites. Joshua 19:47. This is stuck in here because we've got the lot coming up for Dan at this time, and he gets a possession right over there next to the Philistine territory in western Palestine. But he, later on, in the period of the Judges, goes up and takes himself a little more land up north of Palestine. So that's simply inserted in here to let us know exactly what land they had. This is Joshua 19:47. And the coast of the children of Dan went out too little for them. In other words, they had too many people for not enough land. Therefore the children of Dan went up to fight against Leshem, or Laish, and took it and smote it with the edge of the sword, and possessed it, and dwelt therein, and called Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan their father. Okay, where is that found in Judges? Judges 17 through 18. Those two whole chapters, which we'll be looking at next week. Involves the Levite Micah and the migration of the Danites. Judges 17, chapters 17 and 18. An outline of the book goes like this. Chapters 1 and 2 are introduction. Chapters 3 through 16, we have the period of the Judges. Chapters 17 and 18, the migration of the Danites. Chapters 19 through 21, we have the bloody civil war that was caused by the Benjamites. Okay, now we're going to begin our sectional look. We're going to look at the early judges here through chapter 10. And that will leave us with two of our important judges, Jephthah and Samson, along with three minor ones, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, in between those two. So Judges chapter 1 and verse 1. Just like our other books that we've seen, here goes the first verse, tying it right into the previous book, the book of Joshua. Now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, Who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into his hand. Now here's our first account of one of the tribes of Israel asking someone else to come along and help him. Now sometimes God specifically pointed out two or three tribes, such as over in chapter 4, where he talks about Zebulun and Naphtali under the ministry of Deborah going against the Canaanites under Jabin, king of Hazor there, where he said you can have these two tribes. Here he just said one tribe, but Judah wants someone to go along and help him. Judah said unto Simeon, he's going to make this deal. You help me, and when your time comes, I'll help you then. Judah said unto Simeon, his brother, Come up with me into my lot, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I likewise will go with thee into thy lot. So Simeon went up with him. And Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they slew of them in Bezek 10,000 men. And they found Adonibezek in Bezek, and they fought against him, and they slew the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But Adonibezek fled, and they pursued after him, and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and his great toes. Now why did they do this? Well, he tells us in verse 7, As it's been done to you, as you've done to others, so will it be done to you. That's Matthew 7 and verse 12. And Adonibezek, and he evidently recognized this principle of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Because he said 70 kings, having their thumbs and their great toes cut off, gathered their meat under my table, and as I have done, so God hath requited me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. Now, how he died, we don't know. We assume that he bled to death, though. I mean, this is a big Adonibezek, and they cut off his thumbs and his great toes. You know what the great toes are? We call them your big toes today, but they called them, I guess, back then your great toes. So your minus 2 toes and 2 thumbs, and I guess you could bleed a lot from that. And he said in verse 7, I did that for 70 kings. That was his form of torture and punishment. Whenever I captured a country or a people or a king, he said, I did the same thing to them, and as I've done, and so God's going to require it here at my hand. Now this fella is not the same as Adonizedek. Just one letter, the Z rather than the B, is different. Adonizedek we saw in Joshua 10, and he was the king of Jerusalem at that time. One of our first mentions of a king there in Jerusalem, and that was Adonizedek. But Adonibezek is king in Bezek, which is a city, I believe, northeast of Jerusalem. Still in Palestine, west of Jordan River, but northeast of Jerusalem. Now the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem and taken it and smitten it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Now this was only a partial taking of the city, because we're told down in verse 21 that the Jebusites still inhabited the city. Now this particular city, Jerusalem, was right on the border in between Benjamin and Judah. Now Benjamin had their allocation a little bit north of Judah, and Jerusalem was almost right on the border. And so evidently Judah was able to take the southern precincts of the city, but Benjamin was not able to take the northern precincts, because in verse 21 we read, And the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem unto this day. Whereas in verse 8 it says that Judah burnt the whole city with fire. Well, we'd assume only the southern portion of the city, only the part that would have belonged to them. Verse 16, we came ahead earlier in one of our studies and looked at this verse. See if you remember this verse. This takes us back to Numbers 10. The children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law. Now, who's Moses' father-in-law? Jethro. What's his other two names? Reuel. What's his other name? You got 2 out of 3. Raguel. Reuel, Raguel, Jethro. The children of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up out of the city of palm trees with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lieth in the south of Arad. They went and dwelt among the people. Now, do you remember what this is saying here? You probably don't. We'll go back then, just quickly, to Numbers 10 to refresh your memory here. I know this is quite a lot of material to have to remember. And I don't ever even expect you to remember all of the points. Just you're through these teachings, you'll remember a lot of the major things, and the whole Bible will begin to fit better in your mind, fit in a framework. But don't ever think we expect you to remember every one of these details here. We're going to give them to you nonetheless, though. That way, if you ever need to know something, then you've got a whole source, a whole library of notes you can go back to and check something out. But you don't have to remember every one of these things. I do, though. Moses said unto, we're in Numbers 10 and verse 29. Now remember, this is when they're fixing to leave now in the second year. We're over here in the second year in the second month now, the 20th day of the month, whenever they're fixing to leave for the first time Mount Sinai. Moses said unto Hobab, now this is his brother-in-law, the son of Raguel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are journeying unto the place of which the Lord said, I will give it you. Come thou with us, and we will do thee good, and so forth. And remember, he asked him, and he said, you will be our eyes in the wilderness for us, if you'll come with us. And remember, he gives, first of all, he says, no, he won't come. And then Moses asked him a second time and says, we'll do you good if you'll come with us. And he doesn't give us an answer the second time. And so there's always a debate. Did they go with the children of Israel, the Kenites, or did they not? Well, as we showed you from Numbers 10 and now in Judges 1:16, they did go with them. Because here we've got the Kenites all the way over in Palestine along with the Israelites. Now we're going to see them again. That's why I'm mentioning them here. We'll see them again in chapter 4. And then verse 17 is the fulfillment of Judah's pledge from verse 3, where he told Simeon that when his time came, he'd go up with him. So they're swapping off in verse 3 and verse 17. Now we want to read a few verses at the end of this chapter just to show you the sad state of Israel in not possessing the land. Starting with verse 29. Very repetitive, but it goes over several of the tribes and says, neither did such and such, possess their inheritance. Verse 29, neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites. Verse 30, neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. Verse 31, neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko. Verse 33, neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh, and so forth. So we're given several, along with the Benjamites and Judah and so forth, earlier in Judges 1, several tribes here stated explicitly that they did not completely possess the land that God intended for them. Okay, chapter 2. I would say that chapter 2 is the most important chapter in Judges. We read a lot of verses from this last week because it sets the scene and gives us the fourfold cycle that we'll see throughout the rest of the book of the sin, servitude, supplication, and salvation, which we gave you last time. So it's very important. Chapter, God sends an angel. Verse 1, Jesus himself, of course, is the angel of the Lord, and rebukes the people because they've not possessed the land. Now we've got some verses here, verses 6 through 10, that are just, again, stuck in here to set the scene because we've got Joshua dying again. He already died in chapter 1 and verse 1. And here he's stuck in again, dying. But that doesn't mean now he died twice. It just has to provide us with some information before going on in chapter 2. In chapter 3, we have our first 3 judges. So we finally get to the actual period of the judges, as you'll see in your outline that I just gave you. First two chapters are introduction, chapters 3 through 16, the period of the judges. Here in chapter 3, we have, first of all, Othniel. Then we have Ehud. And then we have Shamgar. Othniel delivers them from the Mesopotamians. Ehud from the Moabites, along with the Ammonites and the Amalekites. And Shamgar from the Philistines. Now you'll hear their names sometimes pronounced Philistines, but it's Philistines. They're going to be prominent, as I said, throughout Judges, throughout Samuel, up until the time of David. In Judges 3 and verse 7, we have the first mentioning of the groves that will appear time and time and time again during the period of the monarchy. And the groves had been forbidden back in two scriptures. First of all, in Exodus 34:13 and Deuteronomy 16:21. These were sacred poles and sacred trees that the heathen and pagan nations set up. And of course, Israel fell to doing the same thing. She actually falls doing the same thing over in chapter 6 and verse 25. Now in that verse we just left, Judges 3:7, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served Baalim and the groves. Now here we have an actual example in Judges 6:25. The commandment to Gideon to take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it. So they were just beginning to pick up, more or less by osmosis, because they hadn't kicked out the people. They picked up their habits and all of their false religious practices that God had condemned. Othniel comes on the scene. He's the one that we mentioned earlier that took Kirjath Sepher. He is the nephew to Caleb. And he does a great work for them. Ehud is the left-handed Benjamite that comes against Eglon, a rather amusing story. Eglon is a huge, fat fella that is sleeping in his summer parlor there with people fanning him with palm branches and so forth. And so Ehud, you just get that picture. It's an amusing story. Ehud comes in and, of course, sticks the knife in him so far, and his fat is so big that it closes around the knife and he can't pull the thing back out. So he just leaves it in him. That's in verses 21 and 22. Ehud put forth his left hand. You see, this was by surprise because most people are right-handed. Now, the Benjamites were known for being left-handed. We have a group later on in the history of David that were left-handed, that could sling a stone a hair's breadth. And they were left and right-handed. But it took him by surprise because here he's drawing the knife with the left hand, and it says it thrust it into his belly, and the haft also went after the blade, and the fat closed upon the blade so that he couldn't draw it out. So he just left the knife stuck in him. And he just probably exploded whenever he stuck him like that. And he dies, and Ehud delivers the people, then Shamgar in verse 31. Chapters 4 and 5 go together, and this concerns the judge Deborah and her cohort Barak. Deborah is the only female judge that we have. Now, Barak is not a judge. He's just a helper along with Deborah. But Deborah is the judge, and what else is she also? She's a prophetess. That's in verse 4. Well, both of them are in verse 4. Deborah, a prophetess, judged Israel. So there we've got both of them there in Judges 4 and 4. Now, going up to verse 11, we come back to the subject of the Kenites. And Heber the Kenite, which was of the children of Hobab, the brother-in-law Now, Hobab was the brother-in-law, not the father-in-law. That should be brother-in-law of Moses, had severed himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent unto the plain of Zaanaim, which is by Kadesh. Now, this is what's taken place here. The king of the Canaanites at this time is Jabin, who's king up in Hazor, which is way up here. Now, Deborah is a judge down in the area of Mount Ephraim. She's right down here in this territory. And this is where the king is from. Now, the Kenites had settled over here in the wilderness of Judah, as we saw in chapter 1 of Judges. Now, this particular one, Heber, and he has a wife whose name is Jael, and she's the one that actually kills Sisera, who is the general in control of Jabin's army. Heber has decided to sever himself from the rest of his people. Well, I'll leave it like that. And now he is living all the way up here somewhere in this region. And he evidently is friendly at this time with the Canaanites who have their base in Hazor, because whenever Sisera comes running from trouble, Jael offers a tent, says, come right on in. And he says, do you have a bottle of milk? And or he will ask for water, and she gave him a bottle of milk. And Deborah's prophecy said that she gave him butter on a lordly dish and deceived him, and of course went on to kill him, which is what she does here in the end of the chapter. Verse 20. Again he said unto her, stand in the door of the tent, and it shall be, when any man doth come and inquire of thee, and say, is there any man here? Thou shalt say no. Now this is one of the most gruesome acts in the book of Judges, just to show you how barbarous this period was. Then Jael, now this is a woman of all things, Jael, Heber's wife, took a nail of the tent, and took a hammer in her hand, and went softly unto him, and smote the nail into his temples, and fastened it unto the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary, so he died. What a bloody, barbarous act here by a woman to do. So she took it wasn't a nail, it was a spike. A nail's not long enough to go through someone's head. She took a spike and drove it right through his temples and fastened it to the ground. And to say the least, he died from that. Chapter 5, we have the song of Deborah and Barak. That's one of the most ancient and beautiful pieces of poetry in the Old Testament. All of your critics, friends, all your critics who don't even believe in Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch and think that that was written late, all of them, without exception, will admit that Judges 5 is a very, very ancient piece of literature. Now, you can tell this more from reading the Hebrew, but you can see it a lot here in the English. It's very beautiful, but remember, it's poetic, so you have to take things with a grain of salt that Deborah and Barak say here in Judges 5. Wish we just had time to read all these chapters, but you can read them at home. Beginning with chapter 6 and going through chapter 8, we have the story of Gideon. He, next to Samson, I suppose, is given more space in the book of Judges. So he's one of the three important ones. Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson are the three important ones that are dealt with here in the book of Judges. And Gideon's given 3 whole chapters here. In chapter 6, we have his commission. God sends, first of all, a prophet to Israel, but then he sends the angel of the covenant. The prophet's verse 8. And he sends the angel of the covenant, verse 11, to Gideon himself. Gideon is from the tribe of Manasseh, but he is having evidently to live in Ephraim at this time, which is where Ophrah is, the town mentioned here in verse 11, in order to make a living, because evidently he can't survive where he is there in Manasseh. Chapter 7, we dealt with that whole chapter on a tape, is Gideon's army, where by his 300 men, God says, I'll deliver the host of the Midianites, all the children of the east, who were like grasshoppers for multitude, their camels without number, as the sand by the seaside for multitude. He said, I'll deliver them into your hands by these 300 men. Question or praising the Lord? All righty. I thought that was it, but I couldn't tell. Go right ahead, brother. Verse 24. We're in Judges 7 here. Verse 24, we've got 4 kings or 4 princes of Midian that are mentioned here. 2 of them they kill, and 2 of them he's chasing in chapter 8. So the 4 kings are Oreb and Zeb. The last verse of that chapter, 25, Oreb and Zeb, they kill. And the 2 that he is still chasing are Zebah, this is chapter 8 and verse 5, and Zalmunna. Zebah and Zalmunna. Now he wisely includes the Ephraimites in the end of chapter 7 to fight along with him, but they are pretty mad in the beginning of chapter 8. They wanted to get in on some of the glory. And he's able to pacify him by saying, well, all I did was defeat the people, but you got the 2 kings. So he used a lot of wisdom there by saying, you really did a lot more than I did. Even though he destroyed, as we see, I think it's in this chapter, more than 100,000 men. Verse 10, you want to know how many Gideon's 300 had to fight? There fell 120,000 men. That's pretty big odds, 300 against 20,000. So chapter 8 goes on and gives the account of his victory, his complete victory, and they attempt to make him king. And this is the first attempt Israel has in making someone king over them. Gideon, of course, denies. And that brings us to chapter 9, where his son, by a concubine, Abimelech, he decides to accept for his father. His father, of course, is dead, and he sets himself up as a puppet king. This is Abimelech in chapter 9. Chapter 9, of course, you can see is rather lengthy. In the end, after 3 years, I believe, God put a spirit of controversy between the inhabitants of Shechem and Abimelech, and they fought against each other, and both were destroyed. Then in chapter 10, we have our 6th and 7th judge, Tola and Jair. The very beginning of the chapter. The rest of the chapter kind of reads like chapter 2 again, telling us how miserable the people were and how they cried out to God, and he heard their prayers and answered them. So that's why we're ending here tonight at chapter 10, because here we're going to enter a new period of the judges. They're greatly crying out to the Lord all through the end of chapter 10. And beginning with chapter 11, he's going to raise up Jephthah now, which will be the 8th judge that comes on the scene. And we'll pick up with that then next time.
For a complete